his descendants carved up land, which then became Britain. So we learned about the inhabitants after Brutus and the Trojan army. So we are still reading the chapter before the Romans came. And we'll start here where we left off. It was Dunvallo, Morvidus, who established among the Britons the so-called Mormutine laws, which are still famous today among the English. Included in the other things which Gilda, of blessed memory, wrote about him many years later was this, that it was he who decreed that the temples of the gods and the cities should be so privileged that anyone who escaped to them as a fugitive, or when accused of some crime, must be pardoned by his accuser when he came out. Dunvallo it was, too, who decreed that the roads which led to these temples and cities should be included in the same law, and that the ploughs of the peasantry should be inalienable. During Dunvallo's lifetime, no bandits were allowed to draw their swords, and the outrages of robbers came to an abrupt end, but no one dared to do violence to his fellow. Dunvallo died at last, having spent 40 years in such activities since the day when he took the crown. He was buried in Trinovantum, beside that temple of Concord which he himself had built as a symbol of his own laws. Belinus and Brennius, the two sons of Dunvallo, each of whom was determined to inherit the kingship, now began a great war of attrition against each other. Their object in this struggle was to decide which of the two should be crowned king of the realm. They fought a great number of battles with each other, but at length their friends intervened to make peace between them. These friends decided that the kingdom should be divided between the two of them in such a way that Belinus should be crowned king of the island and hold Leocria, Cambria, and Cornwall. He, being the elder, for Trojan custom demanded that the highest office offered by the inheritance should go to him. They also decided that Brennius, on the other hand, who was the younger, should be subject to his brother, but should rule Northumbria from the Humber as far north as Caithness. A treaty was therefore drawn up to embody these points of agreement, and for 5 years the two of them ruled the country peacefully and justly. The spirit of discord is, however, perpetually on the watch for a chance to put an end to a state of prosperity. Certain ingenious liars came to Brennius and put the following argument to him. How can you be so cowardly, they asked, as to let yourself be domineered over by Belinus, when the fact that you have the same father and mother and the same nobility of birth makes you his exact equal? To this you can add that on the many occasions when Geoffrey, the leader of the Moriani, has tried to gain a foothold in the country, it has been you who have shown in a long series of battles that you could stand up to him, and who have driven him back out of your territory. Why do you not break this agreement, which does you so little honour? Marry the daughter of Elsingius, king of the Norwegians, and with his help recover your lost dignity. When they had corrupted the mind of Brennius with these arguments, and with others of a like nature, the young man agreed to do Elidurus seized the ship on which the girl was, threw grappling irons on board and dragged it away into the middle of his own fleet. As the two sides joined battle in scattered formation and forced their way through the deep sea, a squall got up and suddenly headwinds began to blow. Their ships were dispersed and cast ashore upon different coasts. The Danish king was driven along choose to lead them. Without wasting time, he collected a huge army together and then made a treaty with the Gauls, by which he was allowed to pass in peace through their provinces on his way towards Britain. He fitted out a fleet on the Normandy coast, put out to sea at a moment when the winds were favourable, and so landed on the island of Britain. The moment his brother Belinus learned of the coming of Brennius, he mustered the young men of his entire realm and marched forth to do battle with the invader. As the battalions on the two sides stood waiting in orderly array, ready to join battle the very next instant, the mother of the two leaders, who was still alive, came hurrying through the serried ranks. Her name was Donuena, and she was passionately keen to see the son on whom she had not set eyes for so long. With trembling steps she came to the place where Brennius stood, threw her arms around his neck and kissed him repeatedly with all a mother's love. She bared her breasts before him, and in a voice broken with sobbing, she spoke to him as follows: "Remember, my son, remember those breasts which you once sucked. Remember the womb of your mother, in which the Creator of all things fashioned you as a man-child, from stuff that was not yet human, bringing you forth into the world, while the birth pangs tore at her vitals because of you. Remember all the care and anxiety which I endured for your sake, and then grant me my request. Forgive your brother, curb the anger which is consuming you. You ought to have no ill feeling for Belinus, for he has done you no harm. As for your pretext that you were expelled from your own country by his doing, if you will only consent to examine the truth of the matter carefully, you will find nothing in it that you can possibly call injustice. Indeed, Belinus did not drive you into an exile, where something worse still was going to befall you. On the contrary, he forced you to abandon a humble position so that you could raise yourself to a greater one. Once you were his subject, and you held only part of this kingdom. Now that you have lost that part, you have made yourself the equal of Belinus, for you have seized the kingdom of the Allobroges. What else did Belinus do to you, apart from promoting you from your position as a petty princeling to that of a mighty king? Add to this the fact that the quarrel which arose between the two of you was started by you yourself, not by him, for you were passionately determined to rebel against him, and in this you relied upon the help of the King of Norway. Brennius was moved by what his weeping mother had said. Calmly and quietly he obeyed her. He took off his helmet and went with her to meet his brother. When Belinus saw him coming, with a peaceful look on his face, he threw down his own weapons and ran forward to put his arms around Brennius and kiss him. There and then they became firm friends. Their troops disarmed, and they all entered the town of Trinovantum together. The two discussed with each other what they should do next. They decided to put one common army into the field, to lead this army into Gallic territory, and to subject to their joint dominion all the provinces of that country. 12 months later, Belinus and Brennius crossed over to Gaul and began to ravage the countryside there. When this became known to the Gallic tribes, all the Frankish princes came together to meet the invaders and fought against them. Belinus and Brennius were victorious, and the success in their pursuit of the Gauls. They captured their kings and forced them to surrender. They garrisoned the towns which they had captured, and in 1 year they conquered the entire kingdom. When they had forced all the provinces of Gaul to submit, they set out for Rome with the whole of their immense army and began to plunder cities and farming communities up and down Italy. At that time, Gabius and Porsenna were the 2 consuls in Rome, and the jurisdiction of the country was in their hands. As soon as these 2 realized that no people were strong enough to resist the fury of Belinus and Brennius, they first sought the Senate's approval and then came to the invaders to sue for peace. And friendship. With them they brought many gifts of gold and silver, together with a tribute to be repeated each year, if only they were permitted to retain their own possessions in peace. The 2 kings took hostages from the consuls, and then showed them mercy, leading their own troops off to Germany. No sooner had Belinus and Brennius begun harassing the German people than the Romans repented of their treaty, just described. Their courage revived, and they marched forth to help the Germans. When the kings learned this, they were greatly incensed by it. They consulted each other to see how they could possibly fight 2 peoples at once. So great a force of Italian citizens had arrived that the Britons had much cause for anxiety. After due consultation with his brother, Belinus remained in Germany with his Britons and pressed on with the war against that enemy. Brennius, for his part, marched towards Rome with his own armies, so that he might take vengeance on the Romans for having broken the treaty. When they heard this news, the Italians deserted the Germans. They hurried forward in an attempt to outmarch Brennius, hoping in this way to arrive back in Rome. Belinus was informed of this, and he disengaged his army. Once the next night was over, he set out at full speed and occupied a certain valley through which the enemy had to pass. Belinus hid in ambush along the bottom of the valley and waited for the enemy to arrive. At dawn on the next day, the Italians reached the place in question. As they pressed on with the journey which they had undertaken, when they saw before them the valley which was glittering with the arms of their foes, they were immediately filled with consternation, for they thought that it was Brennius who was there with his Senonian Gauls. The moment the enemy came in sight, Belinus made a sudden charge at them and attacked them with great ferocity. Without more ado, the Romans rushed headlong from the battlefield, for when attacked so unexpectedly, they'd been marching in broken order and without having put on their armour. Belinus pursued them mercilessly, never pausing in his slaughter, until night came on and prevented him from completing the massacre. pleasures of the citizens among their own troops. Once he had won this victory, Brennius stayed on in Italy, where he treated the local people with unheard-of savagery. I have not attempted to describe his other activities there, or his eventual death, for the histories of Rome explain these matters. Had I myself done so, I should have made this work inordinately prolix. so exhausted that he had to give up for a time, he ordered the remainder to be skinned alive, and in this state he had them burned. In the midst of these bestialities and other similar outrages, a calamity occurred which put an end to the iniquity of Morvidus. A monster of unheard-of savageness appeared from the direction of the Irish Sea and began to devour one after the other all those who lived on the neighbouring sea-coast. As soon as this news reached the ears of Morvidus, he went to meet the monster and fought with her single-handed. When he had used all his weapons against her without effect, she rushed at him with her jaws wide open and swallowed him up as though he had been a tiny fish. Morvidus had 5 sons. Gorbonianus was the eldest and succeeded to the throne. At that time there was no man alive who was more unjust than he, or greater lover of equity, and none who ruled his people more frugally. Throughout the whole of his life it was his custom to pay due honour to the gods, and to insist upon common justice for his people. In all the cities in the realm of Britain he restored the temples of the gods, and he also built many new ones. As long as he lived, a great abundance of wealth flooded into the island, such indeed as was enjoyed by none of the neighbouring countries. Gorbonianus encouraged the country folk to till their ground, and he protected them from the oppressions of their overlords. He rewarded his young soldiers with gold and silver, making it unnecessary for any of them to molest his comrade in arms. In the midst of these and many similar actions, which bore witness to his innate goodness, he paid his debt to nature, closed his eyes for the last time, and was buried in the town of Trinovantum. Archgallo, the brother of Gorbonianus, wore the crown after him, and in all that he did he was as different as he could be from his brother. Whenever he could be, he made it his business to do away with the nobles and to exalt the base. He stole their wealth from the rich, and in this way he heaped up untold treasure. The leaders of the realm refused to endure this any longer. They rose in rebellion against him and deposed him from the throne of the kingdom. Then they promoted in his place his brother Elidurus, who was afterwards called the Dutiful, because of the compassion which he showed to Archgallo. When Elidurus had been king for some 5 years, he came upon his deposed brother one day when he was hunting in the forest of Caladarium. Archgallo had wandered about through certain of the neighbouring kingdoms, seeking help so that he might recover his lost honour. He had found no support there, and coming to the point where he could no longer bear the poverty which had overtaken him, he had returned to Britain with a retinue reduced to 10 knights. He was travelling through the above-named forest, seeking those whom he had in earlier times called his friends, when his brother Elidurus came upon him unexpectedly. The moment he saw him, Elidurus ran up to him, embraced him, and kissed him repeatedly. When he had spent some time lamenting the misery to which Archgallo was reduced, Elidurus took him to one of his cities called which caused his removal from the throne. Ennianus was replaced by his cousin Idvallo, the son of Ingenius, and he, warned by the fate of his predecessor, was just and righteous in all that he did. Runo, the son of Perigorus, succeeded Idvallo. Then came Gerinus, the son of Elidurus, and after Gerinus, his own son, Catulus. After Catulus came Milus, then Porix, then Gerin. Three sons were born to Gerin: Fulginius, Edardus, and Adragius, who all reigned one after the other. Next came Eurianus, the son of Andragius, and then in turn Eliot, Clodorcus, Clotenus, Gurgutius, Marianus, Bladudo, Cap, Onus, Cecilius, Beld Gabred. This last surpassed all the musicians of ancient times, both in harmony and in playing every kind of musical instrument, so that he was called the god of minstrels. After him reigned his brother Archmael. Eldol came after Archmael, then Redon, then Redechius, then Samuel, then Penesil, then Pia, then Gabor. Degalius, the son of Gabor, came next, a man modest and prudent in all his actions, and one who cared above all for the fair administration of justice among his people. Heli, the son of Degalus, succeeded him, ruling the kingdom for 40 years. Heli had 3 sons, Lud, Cassivelaunus, and Nennius. Lud, the eldest of these, accepted the kingship after his father's death. He was famous for his town planning activities. He rebuilt the walls of the town of Trinovantum and girded it round with innumerable towers. He ordered the citizens to construct their homes and buildings there in such a style that no other city in the most far-flung of kingdoms could boast of palaces more fair. Lud was a warrior king, lavish in arranging feasts. However many other cities he might possess, this one he